Act 1, Scene 2. A scene that often gets passed over in favour of the famous witches scene that follows it, but that is actually just as important for establishing the key themes of the play. A bloody battlefield. The battle has only just ended. The stage direction reads Alarum, a Latin word from which we get the modern English alarm. It would have signified something like a military fanfare, certainly with bugles and drums, and perhaps with other instruments associated with fighting. Centre stage we see a wounded soldier, still on his feet but covered in blood. King Duncan addresses him, hoping to find out how the battle went, a useful dramatic technique for Shakespeare, so his own audience can be filled in as to what has happened.
What bloody man is that?
This is the sergeant that fought against my captivity.
In response, the sergeant gives a speech that is absolutely fundamental to the play, and which is not quoted from enough in students' essays. He describes the battle between the Scottish forces and the invading army, led by the rebel lord Macdonwald.
Doubtful it stood. The merciless Macdonald from the western isles of Kerns and Galaglasses is supplied, and fortune on his damned quarrel smiling showed like a rebel's whore.
Then we hear how Macbeth charged forward, carving a passage through the invading army before confronting Macdonald, slicing open his torso and then decapitating him.
But all's too weak. For brave Macbeth, well, he deserves that name, disdaining fortune with his brandished steel, which smoked with bloody execution like valor's minion carved without his passage till he faced the slave, which ne'er shook hands with him nor bade farewell till he unseamed him from the nave to the chops and fixed his head upon our battlements.
O valiant cousin, worthy gentleman.
This speech introduces two key motifs that are of fundamental importance to the play. A motif is simply a symbol or a metaphor that is repeated, in one form or another, many times throughout a long text, such that it takes on multiple related meanings. First, we notice that this man is drenched in blood. Obviously, this is a play about murder, so blood is a symbol of murder and death. But the motif of blood has a more complex and specific role in this play, in that it is also associated with prophecy and the supernatural. Here, a man doused in blood speaks of the character of Macbeth, and it is the very fact that he is covered in blood that make Duncan and Malcolm want to listen to him.
So well thy words become thee as thy wounds, they smack of honour both.
Consider other blood-covered characters in this play. Most obviously the blood-covered apparition of a child in Act 4, Scene 1, that tells Macbeth he ought to fear Macduff. Blood takes on this almost supernatural quality. From Lady Macbeth's obsessive idea that her hands are covered in blood, that tortures her with the terrible knowledge of her guilt, to the blood-covered dagger that appears as a sort of supernatural warning to Macbeth on the night of the murder. The blood motif pops up in all of these dreamlike and supernatural moments in the play, and the image of this sergeant standing here, covered in blood, in a trance from his wounds, what we today would call clinical shock, takes on almost the quality of one of the witch's apparitions, speaking proudly of Macbeth's past acts of violence, which, whilst they seem to be noble here, take on a dark foreshadowing power as we relate them to later events in the play. For the sergeant's speech also introduces us to a second key motif in the play, which is that of beheading. Remember, heads in these days are already important symbols both of conquest and royalty, since on the one hand it is the head of your foe that you remove to show that you have destroyed him utterly, and yet also it is the head upon which a king wears his crown. Here the sergeant speaks of how Macbeth stormed forward through the invading army and beheaded Macdonald. Beheading, in this play, is associated with a righteous execution. People who get beheaded are those who would take a crown that does not belong to them. First Macdonald, then Macbeth himself at the end of the play. Beheading is a sort of political execution that deposes the person of his power to ever wear a crown, both metaphorically and literally, revealing that person's claim to the throne as invalid. It is notable, therefore, that Macbeth, for all his murders, never beheads anyone after Macdonald. He stabs Duncan in his sleep. If the crown-bearing head is a symbol of the king's power, then there is a way in which this stabbing is a sign that Duncan is never really vanquished, his crown never really taken from him, in the way that Macbeth's is when Macduff beheads him. By Macduff beheading Macbeth, Malcolm truly becomes king, and the fact that Macbeth does not do so to Duncan is symbolic of the fact that he never really does. The sergeant's speech concludes. He is taken away to the doctors, and Ross enters, another Scottish lord, who brings the good news that the campaign is finally over. Duncan's armies have won, and Macbeth again has played a crucial role. He also reveals another critical piece of information, that the Thane of Cawdor has turned traitor, and played a crucial role in leading the uprising. In response, Duncan strips the Thane of Cawdor of his title, and announces that Macbeth will take it in his place. This is another important piece of foreshadowing, in that it is as Macbeth gains the former Thane of Cawdor's title that he begins down the Thane of Cawdor's fateful path. It is also an important plot point, since Macbeth himself is not yet aware of his new title as we enter into Scene 3. So when the witches call out to Macbeth, "Hail, Thane of Cawdor," Macbeth is rightly confused, and the witches demonstrate their power of prophecy.
Go, pronounce his present death, and with his former title greet Macbeth.
I'll see it done.
What he hath lost, noble Macbeth hath won.
This is the only time in the play that the phrase "noble Macbeth" is uttered, and obviously it is filled with a huge amount of irony, given what Macbeth goes on to do. But it is important to pause here and take a look at one of the poetic techniques that Shakespeare uses to hammer home this irony. We have talked previously about how Shakespeare nearly always writes in blank verse, meaning 10-syllable lines formed from 5 pairs of unstressed and stressed syllables, and how when he modifies this typical verse, it is nearly always significant. Here we see another hugely common way that Shakespeare modifies typical blank verse, which is by writing a line that is nearly blank verse, but in which part of the line cannot possibly be said with the appropriate stress, causing the reader or actor to slow down and place emphasis on a particular word or phrase. What he hath lost, noble Macbeth hath won. This is a 10-syllable line, and for the most part it fits into the pattern of unstressed, stressed syllables that we are used to. But the word noble is simply impossible to fit into this structure. Lost in this context must be a stressed syllable for the sentence to sound natural. The alternative would be what he hath lost, which sounds ridiculous. But it is followed by the 2-syllable word noble, that can only ever take its stress on the first syllable. It's noble, not noble, meaning this line contains 2 stressed syllables right next to each other. The consequence is that it is literally impossible to pronounce this line without placing emphasis on the word noble, massively compounding the irony that is already heavy in that phrase. Try saying it yourself and you'll see. This is such a subtle technique, but it is an extremely effective one, especially given the fact that we are about to be introduced to Macbeth in the subsequent scene. The huge emphasis on the word noble carries through into the subsequent scene, and we as readers are asked to assess Macbeth's behaviour in the light of this word noble that has been hammered home so powerfully in our minds. Who is this noble man we are about to meet?